Welcome back. This is day one of your nervous system. Today's aim is how does the nervous system maintain homeostasis? Let's find out. But before we get to that, you guys have got a do now question. So right now I want you to pause this video and tell me, what do you know about the nervous system and what do you know about the brain? Press play when you're ready to go over it. All right, so since it's the beginning of the unit, I don't expect you guys to know too much about the nervous system or the brain, okay? All I want you guys to know is that it's made up of the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, okay? And when we're talking about where'd my thing go? When we're talking about nerves, we're talking about nerve cells. And today we're gonna take a look at what those nerve cells look like. Now, if you have a fun fact about the brain, I wanna hear it. So send me a message on Remind if you guys have a fun fact about the brain, and maybe, just maybe, I'll give you guys a bonus point on your exit ticket for today. All right. Now, the first thing we're going to do is read a passage about the nervous system. So as I go through this, I want you guys to make any annotations on your paper. And we're going to use the information we learn in this passage to answer the questions that follow. So here we go. Regulation in humans involves the interactions of the nervous and the endocrine systems. These two systems are similar in that they both secrete chemicals, and they both play a major role in the maintenance of homeostasis. In general, they differ in that the response of the nervous system are more rapid and of shorter duration than those of the endocrine system. The two major components of the nervous system are the brain and the spinal cord. The nervous system is made up of nerve cells, or neurons, which are adapted for the transmission of impulses. Now, when we see this word impulses, we're just talking about chemical signals that the nervous system sends. So impulses are chemical signals. The nervous system contains 3 different types of nerve cells, which differ both in structure and function, meaning they look different and they do different things. There are the sensory neurons, interneurons, and the motor neurons. And below, I'm going to tell you what each of those things do. So first up is sensory neurons. Now, when you think of the word sensory, I want you to think of your 5 senses. Right, your 5 senses are we see, we hear, we can touch, we can taste, and what am I forgetting? We hear, right? So those are the 5 senses, and each of those senses involve the use of sensory neurons. So what our neurons or our sensory neurons do is they transmit impulses, remember those chemical signals, from the sensory organs. We're going to call those sensory organs our receptors. So the sensory neurons take in those messages from our eyes, from our ears, from our nose, and they're going to send those messages to the brain and the spinal cord. So all of those sensory organs that are needed are the eyes, ears, tongue, nose, and skin. So all of those organs are going to rely on sensory neurons to send that information to the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, but then once the sensory neurons send that message to the brain and spinal cord, we have to have interneurons in the middle to interpret that message. So when you think of interneurons, I want you to think of the word interpret, because they interpret the message that the sensory neuron has just sent to them, and then they send that message out to something we call the motor neurons. So we find these interneurons in the spinal cord and the brain, and once they take in the message from the sensory organs, from the sensory neurons, they're going to transmit those nerve impulses from the sensory neurons to the motor neurons. So you find those in the middle. So they're kind of like the middlemen. I'll write that instead. Ooh, it's going slow. Wait for it. Come on, we're almost there. All right, we finally made it. All right, so our interneurons are like the middlemen of this system. They take the messages from the sensory neurons and they send them to the motor neurons. But what are the motor neurons? Well, the motor neurons are in charge of transmitting impulses from the brain and the spinal cord to what we call the effectors. Right? These effectors are what are doing the action. So specifically muscles and glands. So when you think of motor, I want you to think of movement or action that's happening. Okay, so these motor neurons send messages to our muscles or to our glands to do something. to perform some action. So below, I've got a picture of what each of these look like. So I'm going to give you guys an example. So one of my sensory organs is my eyes. All right, here's my eye. And let's say that I look over and I see on my table, there's a cup of coffee. My saving grace. Okay, here's my coffee. So once I see that coffee, my sensory neurons are going to send that message to my brain and my spinal cord. Okay, that sensory neuron is basically sending the message of, she sees coffee. Okay, that message is then going to go to my interneurons, remember my interpreters. Right, and those interneurons are found in the brain and spinal cord. And those interneurons, once they get that message, they're going to send that message straight to what we call our motor neurons. Those motor neurons are then going to send the message out to my motor organs. So let's say my arm muscle. And they're going to tell me, hey, oh my God, is that a hand? What is that? Looks like a turkey. Right, there's my hand. And they're going to tell me, grab the coffee. So once my motor neurons and once my effector, my motor organ, gets that message, it's going to tell me, hey, you should pick up that coffee and maybe you should take a sip of it. Right? So that is how our nervous system sends signals. Sensory organs intercept the message. They see it, they feel it, they hear it. Sensory neurons send that message to our brain and spinal cord. Interneurons send another message out to our motor neurons that then perform the action needed. Okay, we're going to see several examples of this over the next few days, so don't panic if it's a little bit unclear right now. Right now, we've got some questions to answer about what we just read. Number one is, how does the nervous system regulate homeostasis? Well, we need to know that the nervous system secretes chemicals that regulate a given situation, specifically chemical signals. Okay, and we need to know that the nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, as well as our nerve cells or neurons. Which leads us to number two. The nervous system is composed of nerve cells or neurons. What are they adapted for? Well, we need those nerve cells in order to transmit impulses. And remember, this word impulses means chemical signals that are sent throughout the nervous system. But what is the major role of the sensory neurons? So we learned about 3 different types of neurons. Well, sensory, remember I told you to think of your 5 senses. So our sensory neurons transmit impulses, those chemical signals, from the sensory organs to the nervous system. So they send the messages from our eyes, ears, tongue, nose, and skin to our brain and spinal cord. But what's the major role of the motor neurons? Well, the motor neurons are going to transmit impulses from the nervous system out to the response system, to your effectors. Remember, effectors are what's doing the job, so specifically your muscles and your glands. So when you think of motor neurons, think of movement. Action is about to happen. But in order for that to happen, there has to be an interpreter, and that's when our interneurons come in. So what is the role of the interneurons? Well, they're found in the brain and spinal cord, and they're going to transmit information between the sensory and motor neurons. So they're found in between those 2 neurons. All right. Now, this is a picture of what a nerve cell or a neuron looks like. So I know what you're thinking, like that doesn't look like the cells we looked at in class, but remember that cells differ in terms of what function they serve. So your muscle cells are going to look different than your skin cells, and your nerve cells are no different. So nerve cells are adapted for receiving and sending signals or messages. Remember, we call those impulses. So what ends up happening is these dendrites are kind of like these root-like structures at the base of the cell. And they're going to receive messages or receive signals. So these finger-like extensions are going to reach out places and basically grab signals. Right? So these chemical signals are going to come up to the surface. Those signals are going to go inside the cell. They will then be transported along what's called the axon until finally they reach something called the axon terminal. Now, when you think of the word terminal, you might think of like an airport terminal, right? And it's an easy way to remember that because airplane terminals or airport terminals are where planes get ready to shoot off. The same thing happens here with those chemical signals. The axon terminal is where chemical signals shoot off. So the signals will come right up to the edge of this axon terminal and then shoot off to the next neuron. Right, I'll draw us a little airplane. Oh man, that is beautiful. That's an airplane, right? Perfect. All right, I've got another image of what that looks like. Wait for it. So here is another picture, right? Same thing, the dendrites are going to receive messages from other cells. Those chemical signals will come into the cell and move along what we call the axon. So that axon passes messages from one side of the cell to the other. Then those chemical signals are going to go over to the terminal, the axon terminal, where those messages will actually shoot off to another nerve cell. So here we see that the dendrites of another nerve cell are actually connected directly to our axon terminal. So those chemical signals are going to bounce from one neuron to the next. And what ends up happening is all of these neurons are bundled together in a structure that looks like this. So you have got billions of neurons in your head that are all connected in this crazy web of signals that allows messages and signals to be sent all throughout your brain and really allows you to function. All right. Now we've got a few notes we need to take about the nervous system, okay? So follow along with me. The nervous system is composed of neurons connected to receive, transmit, and process information. So the three things you need to, or 4 words you need to write down are receive, transmit, and process information. But what exactly is a neuron? Well, a neuron is just another word of saying nerve cells. So these are still animal cells, right? They're found within us, so they're animal cells, but they're specifically designed for the nervous system. So we call them nerve cells. But what is the nervous system and what are impulses? Well, we need to know that the nervous system is a network of nerve cells that carry those chemical signals or chemical messages called impulses. Right, so you can call them messages, you can call them signals, up to you. Right, and how are messages received? Well, this is where 2 things called receptors and effectors come into play. Receptors are going to receive signals or receive stimuli. And these are going to be our sensory organs. So things like our eyes, our ears, our nose, things like that are going to receive those messages, or receive the stimuli, I should say. And then we've got effectors, and effectors are going to respond to the stimulus. So I wrote effectors, but you need to know that these are things like muscles and glands. So this is what's doing the action. But what exactly is a stimulus? Now, we're not talking about a stimulus check, okay? A stimulus, when we're talking about the nervous system, is anything that causes a receptor to start an impulse in a nerve pathway. So it's basically anything that causes your nervous system to react. So something like heat or cold or pain or pressure are all things that are going to basically activate your nervous system and tell them, hey, there's something going on. Okay, so anything that causes a receptor to start an impulse is known as a stimulus. The last thing we're going to cover today is something called the reflex arc. So each of us are equipped with reflexes, right? These are things that you don't even have to think about. Your body just does. So one example is, suppose you're old enough to drive, and as you're driving down the road, you see a child run into the street. What are you going to do? Now, I hope that you're not going to speed up your car, right? It's naturally a reflex to slam on the brakes. But how does that happen? So the route that impulses take is, first step is your receptors. Your sensory organs see that there's a kid in the street. Right? So this is our receptor. Our eyes are going to see that there's a kid in the street. But then the next step, in order for that message to make it all the way to your leg muscle to slam on the brake, we need our sensory, there it is. We need our sensory neurons. Okay, our sensory neurons are in communication with our sensory organs. So they're going to take that message, take that signal, and send that message to the brain. All right, send message to brain and spinal cord. But then remember, we have to have that interpreter in the middle of those neurons, and that interpreter is called our interneurons. So our interneurons are found in the brain and the spinal cord, and they interpret the message from the sensory neurons. Okay, and then they send that message to our motor neurons. Which means that our next step is our motor neurons. Okay, so our motor neurons take that message from our interneurons, and they're going to send that message along to our motor organs. So things like your muscles and your glands. So the motor neurons send that message forward. I'm not going to write that. I'm just going to go to the next part. Come on. I think I lost something. It deleted. I'm not sure what it deleted, whatever. The motor neurons then send that message to your effectors, and your effectors, of course, are what perform that action. So in this case, our effector is our muscle cell, specifically our leg muscle, that's going to slam on the brakes and avoid hitting that child in the street. Okay, so here is our effector, your leg muscle, then slams on brake. Okay, so that message gets sent over here. Beautiful. All right, guys. Now, again, I know this is a really, really tricky subject. So if you're looking at me like, what the heck is she talking about? I don't even know what a neuron is. You're okay. I promise. We're going to be talking about this for the next 3 or 4 days. So if you have any questions, send me a message on Remind. But other than that, you're good for the day. So as soon as you're done with this video, complete your exit ticket, press submit, and have a wonderful afternoon. I'll see you guys tomorrow.